Horsley, Gloucestershire, Middle England, which today has 300 properties, 750 residents within a 6-mile area near the market town of Stroud. You would be hard-pressed to remember any events that happened to it except a murder that occurred in 1902 between two lifelong friends. Over to you, James, to reveal this tragic tale.
This remarkable story is set in the west of England county of Gloucestershire. The year is 1902, in the village of Horsley, nearby to the thriving town of Stroud. It was, and is still today, mainly a farming as well as cloth-weaving community, and at the time of these events had a population of around 900 people. There was a 17th century property nearby called Barton Hill House. It was a residence of Lawrence Williams, a justice of the peace and a retired army major, and his family. They were respected and well thought of in the area, and had brought up 5 children, who were all privately educated. The sons were Marshall, who was born in 1863, and William, born in 1865. By the beginning of the century, Marshall had no real occupation, and William had developed a reputation as being a bit wayward and wild, as well as not getting on too well with his father. He had spent some time in North America before returning to Horsley. He was still without work, and would often spend periods of time with friends in London. William became friends with a neighbour by the name of John Scott, who also came from a well-to-do family and had time on his hands. He was able to afford to live from a legacy left to him by his father, who had died when he was a child. He was married and had 2 children, and was an avid book collector, and was seen as amenable and of mild temperament, which was in contrast to William's rather erratic nature. They resided at the nearby house called the Priory, which dated back over 400 years. The 2 friends both enjoyed the relatively new and popular cycling trend, and went on frequent excursions around the locality. It was, and still is, a well-liked means of transport and recreation. In May 1902, Lawrence Williams put the family home, Barton End House, up for sale, much to the dislike of William, who started to become more unbalanced at the news, to the extent of muttering threats about going out and harming people. This brought the attention of the police, who decided to keep an eye out for him. Scott, as his friend, offered William the opportunity to move in with him until he could find his feet, as his family relocated to Surrey. To compound William's dilemma, Scott had also decided to up sticks and move elsewhere, putting the Priory up for rent. William split his time between the Scotts and occasional trips to London. Mrs. Scott had taken a dislike to William, feeling that he had a bad character and was an undue influence on her husband. She had misgivings about their lodger's sanity, and found his behaviour quite untoward, thoughts that her husband did not share. Over the successive months, William's behaviour worsened to the extent that he was banned from a shop in Stroud because of his gruff and rude behaviour towards the staff. People in the area became wary of him and tended to stay out of his way. The only people to tolerate him at all were his brother Marshall and John Scott. In mid-August, Mrs. Scott went on a trip to the home counties to stay with her brother, taking the children with her for this short break. The only residents of the Priory were William, Scott and the staff. One evening after supper, the 2 friends decided to go on a bike ride. It was a clear moonlit night, and with little or no traffic or indeed people around, it was an ideal time to go for a short, relaxing jaunt. Sometime into their journey, in the middle of the countryside and some miles away from where they had started, they were passed by a man on a horse and cart, who immediately recognised one of them as William Williams. According to his recollection, both men, who were pushing their bikes up a hill at the time, looked to be in some kind of heated discussion. Some hours later, a policeman who was passing the Priory noticed William pushing his bike, which had no front light on, towards the house. This was not an unusual sight for the constable, who was aware that the two men often took bike rides late in the day. What was unusual was that William was alone and not accompanied by Scott. One of the staff at the Priory was Martha Wilkins, who would often wait up for the two men to return from their nocturnal rides. At 11:30 p.m, she decided to go to bed, as it was late, thinking that the riders would return in the morning, as they did from time to time. She heard someone come through the front door and go upstairs. After a few minutes, the person was heard hurriedly leaving the house. Who that person was, she had no idea. At about midnight, just outside of Stroud, a patrolling policeman saw a man on a bike with no light on coming towards him and flagged him down. The man explained that his light had run out of power and that he needed to get to Stroud urgently. The constable recognised the man as William, the family being well known in the locality, and issued him with a summons for riding in the dark without showing a light. William was rather annoyed at this, but was allowed to go on his way. By 1 o'clock in the morning, he was at Stroud railway station, where he left his bike in the safe keeping of the station porter. He caught the express train to London and arrived at Paddington Station at around 3 in the morning, where he took a hansom cab across the city. The brother had been staying at the Golden Cross Hotel in Charing Cross and had earlier sent a telegram to the Priory to see if his brother was still staying there. The reply came back that he was. He was under the impression that William was going on a trip to France the following day and wanted to see him before he left, but he was not expecting him to turn up in the middle of the night. Marshall was fast asleep in bed when there was a loud knocking on the door. It was his brother, who was in a worked-up state. He announced that he had killed his friend John Scott. Marshall did not believe him, and they both talked over the next hour. William remained in an agitated and nervous state, pacing up and down the room, and strangely exclaiming that it was the best thing for Scott, and it would be the best idea if he surrendered to the police before anyone else was harmed. Marshall did not entirely believe his brother's rantings, but came to the conclusion that Scott may have come to some harm and could need help. William finally left and checked into a nearby hotel he had stayed in before. The fact that it was in the middle of the night and he was unkempt, nervous, and without a suitcase did not seem to arouse suspicion, as he had been a previous client, and they had grown accustomed to his often out-of-place manner. Back in Gloucestershire, the staff at the Priory were going about their morning routine. A maid discovered that both her employer and his wayward guests had not slept at the house the previous night, but was not unduly concerned, as this had happened in the past. A shepherd was on his way to work at Saddlewood Farm when he noticed a bicycle lying in a field. He moved it to a gate next to the road, where he noticed some tools and an oily rag on the tarmac, which led him to think that the cyclist may have been in some sort of car accident. Curious, he decided to have a look around. It wasn't long before he made the grim discovery of a body lying face down in some undergrowth. It all looked rather suspicious, as it appeared that the body had been dragged along the ground to where it had been left, and that there had been some attempt made to conceal it with some branches. The police and a doctor were hastily called, and on examination of the corpse, a bullet wound to the head was found. It was clearly a case of murder. Robbery did not seem to be a motive, as all the valuables of the victim were not removed. Papers on the body revealed the identity of the victim. It was John Scott. The police at first thought that Scott had been killed by strangers. A number of rough-looking non-locals had been seen around in the area in the past few weeks, but in the end they came to the conclusion that it was not a random attack. It was not long before the police realised the last person seen with Scott was William Williams. A search of his bedroom at the Priory revealed clothes stained with grass and soil, and in a coat pocket was discovered a revolver. One shot had been discharged, and the gun had been fired recently. Meanwhile, Marshal Williams was packing his suitcase in preparation for the journey home when he discovered that his Smith & Wesson revolver was missing. His immediate thought was that his brother had taken it in order to shoot himself with the remorse of killing his friend, but he apparently put this out of his mind, showing no urgency, and after breakfast went round to his brother's hotel. He knocked on the room door, but received no reply, even after calling out his brother's name. He tried the door. It was unlocked, so he went in. He would not have been prepared for the scene before him. There, sprawled on the bed, was the body of his brother. He had put a revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. Marshall then calmly left the room, closing the door behind him, and went to the reception desk and asked for the manager, whom he told what he had witnessed upstairs, stating that he had to leave London for a few hours, but would return later in the day to speak to the authorities. He made no mention of the conversation he had had with William concerning the demise of Scott, behaviour which might seem odd concerning the events of the previous hours. The London police contacted the Gloucestershire Constabulary, at which point the connection between Scott's death and that of William were connected. Marshall, meanwhile, had returned to his home in Sevenoaks, where he managed to contact Evelyn Scott's brother and agreed a hurried meeting. As a result, both of them travelled to the West Country with some urgency, where they found that Scott's body had been discovered. Marshall finally decided to speak to the police and divulge all that he knew. The inquest in Stroud was started and adjourned in order to get more information about William Williams from London. The London inquest commenced a few days later, with the main witness being Marshal Williams. His testimony was, to his knowledge, his brother and Scott had been close friends, and that it had come as a shock when William had revealed that he had killed Scott, but did not know the reason why. He admitted that his brother had threatened to commit suicide several times in the past, and had suffered depression and anxiety since childhood. He said that it was his opinion that his brother had not been of sound mind for a number of months, and that the family had been worried about him to the extent that it had been considered putting him into psychiatric care. The coroner's jury verdict was suicide whilst being temporarily of unsound mind. They also censured the brother for his rather relaxed attitude to the events leading up to the suicide, and for disappearing from London before being interviewed by the police. One mystery, however, remained unanswered. What exactly was the motive? There was much speculation as to how two close friends had fallen out, if indeed that was the case. There was a witness who had seen them having an argument on the road. Staff at the Priory had never witnessed any cross words between the two over the preceding months. Was it connected with the Scots' plan to move away from the area, somewhere William had always found sanctuary from his mental struggles, especially after his own family had moved away? Was it just a spur-of-the-moment impulse, or had it been premeditated, as a loaded weapon had been taken by William on the night of the bike ride? Had the disdain of Scott's wife trawled up pent-up, deeply held emotions? It was known that Mrs. Scott wanted William out of the house and their lives as soon as possible. Did William feel abandoned after the anchor of his friendship with Scott was about to be severed? Other theories were put forward, including the state of the marriage of the Scotts. We may never know the root cause of these two sad deaths. John Scott's funeral was held on the 19th of August at Horsley Parish Church and was widely attended. The funeral of William Williams was due to be held a week later at the same church. It had been assumed that he would be interred in the family plot in the churchyard, but a vociferous outcry and protest from the parishioners meant he was buried in Stroud. The funeral took place in Kensal Green in London. The inquest into the death of John Scott was held at the end of August, and the jury's verdict was that of wilful murder. It was noted that the use of a bicycle without a light was the perfect way to cross the countryside undetected, so that the perpetrator could carry out the crime and make good his escape noiselessly. The sound of a gun going off would have been missed in the middle of the countryside, and even if it had been heard, it was not uncommon for farmers to hunt rabbits after dark. The priory was eventually sold, and the family were able to move away from the horrible memories. It is still a private house to this day, its ancient walls perhaps yet to reveal the secret of the actual reason behind the murder of John Scott. Now, John, bizarre set of events. How do you see it?
One of the significant themes in murder is that the culprit and the victim know each other. In the case of serial killers, it is very difficult for the police to find the murderer. If the victim is chosen at random, it is pointless building up a profile as there is no connection between the two parties. Unless there are witnesses or CCTV, where does one start an investigation? Murder-suicide is a rare and usually merits headlines. The most famous in recent times was the murder of the playwright Joe Orton by his lover Kenneth Halliwell. Think carefully before approaching victims, witnesses, or others affected by murder-suicide, as they may be traumatized by the event. Given that the victim is now dead, we can safely adduce that he has been traumatized. We can assume that the tabloids in Fleet Street will have taken this sage piece of advice to heart and will not tolerate lines like, "Apart from this, Mrs. Lincoln, did you enjoy the play?" There have been a number of studies on the subject, largely in the USA. They concluded that the culprits were largely white male, the setting was domestic, and a gun was used. The events in Horsley in 1902 followed this pattern.